Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Sarah Birmingham. I am a professor here at the College of Law. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the college this morning and to welcome those who are joining us on the live stream as well. We're delighted that you could join us. This is our final lecture for the fall term, and so we thank you for your attendance. As we gather here today, we acknowledge we are on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I would like to express our gratitude to McKercher LLP, whose generous sponsorship enables our college to host these lectures. These lectures enrich the mind of our law students and all of those who attend. I would also like to thank our guest speaker, Timothy Caulfield, who is joining us here today. Professor Timothy Caulfield is a Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy, a professor in the Faculty of Law and the School of Public Health, and a research director of the Health Law Institute at the University of Alberta. His interdisciplinary research on topics like stem cells, genetics, research ethics, the public representations of science, and public health policy has allowed him to publish over 350 academic articles. He has won numerous academic and science communication and writing awards. He is a member of the Order of Canada and a fellow of both the Royal Society of Canada and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. He contributes frequently to the popular press, and he is the author of 2 national bestsellers, The Cure for Everything, Untangling the Twisted Messages About Fitness, Health, and Happiness, 2012, and his other book is Gwyneth Paltrow, Wrong About Everything, When Celebrity, Culture, and Science Clash, 2015. His most recent book is Relax, Damn It, A User's Guide to the Age of Anxiety. Professor Caulfield is the co-founder of the Science Engagement Initiative, #ScienceUpFirst, and was the host and co-producer of the award-winning documentary TV show, A User's Guide to Cheating Death, which has been shown over 60 countries, including streaming on Netflix. And so without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Caulfield.
Thank you so much. It is a real pleasure to be here, see with my friends, Barb and Sarah. They're actually trainees of mine, so Sarah had to say nice things about me. But it is a real pleasure to see you guys thriving and to be at this wonderful institution. I'm going to talk today about something that I'm incredibly passionate about, something that I really think is one of the defining issues of our time, and that is the spread of misinformation. Look, I mostly work in the health space, but this is a topic that is touching all of our lives. It's touching people around the world. It's having an impact really on democracy. So I think this is an urgent topic, and I hope my presentation today will both shed some light on what's going on and how we got here, but also what we can do about it. You know, as individuals, as professionals, as students, as institutions, to push back against the noise. Look, I have been working in this space for a really long time, and it's been bad for a really long time, especially in that health sphere. So let me take you on a little bit of a warm-up journey here. With health misinformation, if you look, it's been around for a very long time. Right? You know, there was health misinformation as soon as we started talking together. But let's just go back to like the 1960s and think about how the context, right? The context that was relevant to health misinformation then, right? It was a little bit new agey, right? It was a little bit counterculture. It was a little bit coming from the left, right? Yeah, this is Woodstock, by the way. Think about that, and we're going to come back to it, okay? Let's go forward a couple decades, right? And then we have this corporatization, right, of wellness and fitness, and I actually owned those leg warmers, and I think Barb maybe have seen a picture of me in those. And think about it, right? We have this sort of normalization of how we all start talking and thinking about health, right? That matters. Let's go forward a little bit more, and we get this guy, right? And I think Dr. Oz, one of my nemesis, by the way, but Dr. Oz, he's important to this story, right? Because I think, and there's some evidence to back this up, that he helped to normalize pseudoscience, right? Normalize sort of this embrace of misinformation, right? He brought it to middle America, and he almost created an expectation that this was something that we should all, at a minimum, be considering, but maybe even embracing, right? So let's go forward about a decade, and we get my friend Gwyneth Paltrow in a giant vagina, right? So Gwyneth, and she's just emblematic of a broader movement, right? Does not stand alone in this responsibility, but I think Gwyneth and others like her also play a very important role in the context of the spread of misinformation, because she does represent the role of celebrity culture, right, of popular culture in the spread of misinformation, and sort of was an echo of the influencers of today, right? So, and the other reason I think Gwyneth is interesting is because we do start to see this pushback, right? Now look, I'm going to ask this question. How many people here have not heard about the jade vagina egg? Wow, this is a very sophisticated audience. There's a lot of you that haven't heard about the jade vagina egg. Okay, so it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a jade vagina egg that you're supposed to put and it's supposed to align your energy, etc. Now she did, oh, by the way, Sarah, right before the pandemic, I gave a talk at Baylor Medical College, and as a gift, they gave me jade vagina eggs. No pressure. No pressure. I didn't know where to put them. They're on my shelf at home. So, but she gets sued $145,000 and loses. Now, that's not a lot of money to Goop and Gwyneth, but you start to see this regulatory response, I think, to the misinformation. And you also, I think, start to see this become part of the broader cultural conversation. What do we do about all this health misinformation? So let's go from Gwyneth's vagina to Tucker's testicles. Now, how many people have heard about this? Few people have heard about this. So Tucker Carlson, as you know, a conservative commentator, he actually did a documentary called The End of Men, where he was suggesting that the world is becoming less manly, and this is a real problem, and we need to do something to boost our testosterone, among other things, and that includes radiating our testicles. Okay, think about that journey. Okay, from Woodstock to Tucker's testicles, and we're going to come back to that. And we also know that this misinformation obviously is having a massive spillover effect on things like vaccination. And yes, I'm going to talk about vaccines today, only because there's so much research on that topic. But we see this kind of spillover, right? This growing hesitancy for vaccines, which is going to kill people, right? And look at this example. Did you guys see this data? Actually, a friend of mine did this study. Over 50% of people in the United States are worried about vaccinating their dogs as a spillover effect of the rhetoric that surrounded the COVID vaccines, which this is relatively recent research, as you can see. And part of the reason is they're worried about dog autism, right? Which is pretty stunning, right? It's an absurd result, but speaks so much to where we are right now. Do you guys agree? So it is an extraordinary time. In addition to that, of course, and something that we've studied a lot at our institute, we see all these unproven therapies being pushed, right? Now, I'm often asked, we're keeping on the dog theme here. I'm often asked, what is one of the worst remedies I've heard about? And this is up there, right? A woman drinking her dog's urine. And I love the fact that it's good for her skin, but it also can cure cancer, right? So this is very powerful. By the way, I don't know if you guys knew this. Urine had a really big couple of years. Did you guys know that? People are drinking dog urine. They're drinking their own urine, right? They're drinking cow urine. Don't do any of that. Okay, so look, these things are absurd, and they're easy to make light of. But we know that misinformation is doing incredible harm. Over the past year, the head of the FDA has suggested, and I think there's empirical evidence to back this up. It's hard to draw a causation line here, but I think this is informed speculation, that misinformation, health misinformation, is contributing to the erosion in life expectancy in the United States. And he has said this over and over the last year, and I think it's justified. And as you guys probably know, in the United States, life expectancy is a 25-year low right now in the United States. We see this concern of misinformation being picked up virtually World Health Organization, virtually every nation state is looking at this now, and even at the level of the UN, right? Saying we have to respond to this crisis, right? And that's, hopefully, we're going to do a little bit of that today. We also have research that tells us the public, or the general public, recognizes the harm that misinformation is doing. So this is another interesting study that came out last summer, summer before last, and I think the timing is interesting because this is right after sort of the teeth of the pandemic, right? And you can see these results here, right? For the general public, there is a belief that misinformation is one of the gravest threats to humanity, right up there with climate change, right? So that's where we are. And then look at this study again, quite recent from Pew in the United States. They do good work there, and I personally find these results amazing. This is the United States, where the First Amendment, right, freedom of expression, is like a religion, right? It's like a religion down there, and you can see that even there, a majority of Americans, and an increasing number of Americans, feel that the spread of misinformation is so bad that they think fighting misinformation is more important than freedom of expression. Now, we can have an interesting debate about whether that's true or not. I'm just interested in the public perception that is emanating from the United States. By the way, an interesting aside, you wouldn't believe those numbers if you just listened to cable news and talk radio, and those numbers are quite unusual. But I think this speaks to where we are right now. And who can blame the public for feeling this way, right? We have just come out of the pandemic where absolutely absurd things were said over and over again. And I'm just going to focus on the absurd stuff here. I'm not even going to talk about the marginal things. How many people heard this one? I bet everyone, right? Anyone not hear this one? Really? Where do you guys live? So there is this idea. I guess it speaks more to where I live. This was a myth that obviously that the vaccines would make you magnetic. You take the vaccines and they will make you magnetic, which is completely absurd and not scientifically plausible. I love this picture too because of the expression on that. What is she saying? And then there's this headline. I actually thought this was satire, but not satire, right? So Michael Flynn, this is a former national security advisor, started spreading this idea that the government or some nefarious organization was putting vaccines in salad dressing. Again, scientifically absurd, and it wouldn't work, right? Everyone knows Americans don't eat salad. And then we have this. People heard this one, right? So this is the idea that we were all hypnotized, and that's what we got. And this one still has legs, by the way. This one is still out there. So, Van Morrison, I used to love Van Morrison, also was a big proponent of this one. And then we have this idea that this is very common now. There are entire websites dedicated to this idea of detoxing vaccines from your body. The idea that you could pull the vaccines out, using cupping or bleach or venom kits. Don't do any of this, please. But this is where we are. And of course, I could go on and on. So can we do anything about it? Well, I think the answer is yes, and I'm going to come to that. But there are several reasons why I think we're in a tough spot. And I am going to talk a little bit about those things. I'm going to talk about several very obvious conclusions, okay? And tell you why these obvious conclusions are important. And the first one is, yes, I am talking about misinformation. So this is becoming more of an important topic. And you may have even heard this rhetoric that is out there right now. The idea that, this isn't really misinformation, that these are reasonable perspectives that are being silenced. Have you guys heard that? Right? And any effort to fight misinformation is actually an effort to curb open debate and to, infringe on our rights. What I'm talking about today is misinformation, just the stuff that is clearly wrong. We wrote a piece recently in the CMAJ where we touch on this. There's this revisionist history that's happening right now, how we view what happened in the past and in our very recent past. And this is happening not just with COVID, but with a whole host of topics. But I think the key here I want to highlight, there are things that are wrong, right? They're lies. The world is not flat, right? That's a lie, right? The Sandy Hook massacre, it happened. To say otherwise, that's a lie, right? That's a lie. It's a lie that does incredible harm, right? Trump did not win the election. The big lie is a lie. It's a lie. The current Speaker of the House in the United States doesn't think it's a lie, but it is a lie. Did you guys know 60 to 70% of Republicans believe the big lie? Which is astounding, right? This is not true. This is not something that's on the margins that need to be debated. It's a lie, right? And lizard people do not run the United States. Well, actual lizard people don't run the United States. Now, that number is disputed, the 12 million. There have been a number of surveys that have looked at this, but it's in the millions. It's in the millions of Americans believe that. And even this absurd lie can have real consequences, right? People in the room probably know this. There's many of the mass murders in the United States, the perpetrator believed the lizard people. Now, obviously, those are very complex psychological and cultural and social events, not blaming it only on lizard people beliefs, but even absurd stuff can do real harm, and we're going to come back to that. But what's important to recognize that there are other lies, right? If we just look at the COVID, and I apologize, everyone's sick of COVID, I'm sick of it too, but if we just focus on some of the rhetoric that did real harm, we can identify things that were clearly lies. Ivermectin does not work for COVID. And yes, we all know the backstory. It won the Nobel Prize as a parasitic. We know it's effective as a parasitic in both animals and in humans, but it has never been shown to be effective in the context of COVID. And there have been many good clinical trials that have found exactly that, right? So that's a lie, right? We also know that vaccines don't cause infertility. That is a lie, and one that was spread and still spreads today, right? Doing real harm. There's never been any evidence to suggest that it does, and in fact, there have been studies post-COVID and that have continued to go on that show it does no harm at all. But that lie continues to spread. And by the way, those of you who do work in the vaccine space will know this is a very common myth that anti-vaxxers put out because they know it's going to have a lot of power. If you're a young adult or you're a parent, it has, this idea that it might impact fertility has an impact on that cost-benefit analysis that you might do when you're considering getting a vaccine. So this is a lie, and it's a lie that does real harm. This is another one, the died suddenly one, the idea that vaccines have killed more people than COVID, that vaccines have killed many doctors and young people. Have you guys heard this one? Yeah, and it continues to spread and do real harm. And here's a very recent example, right? Just days ago, right? That as soon as he died, as soon as Matthew Perry, I'm a bit of a fan too, by the way, as soon as Matthew Perry died, these lies started to spread. And they have an impact. So there are things out there that are lies, right? So that's, I think, it's important to recognize. And if we just focus on those things, right? We don't need to talk about, how much, how many boosts, who should get the booster and when they should get it. There's interesting conversations going on in the scientific community about that. There's interesting conversations about when should we have vaccine mandates. That is a completely valid political discussion, legal discussion, ethical discussion to have. We're not talking about that. We're talking about stuff that are clearly lies. This was a study that we did not that long ago where we found that on the contrary, these ideas aren't being silenced. They're getting more exposure, right? These ideas, these lies have not been marginalized. They get sort of outsized attention in pop culture. This is a study we did on natural herd immunity. We've done it on a couple of topics and consistently find the same thing. These things aren't being silenced. In fact, the BS is being amplified. And the other thing I find so fascinating and so infuriating is often people are complaining about being silenced and being marginalized on the world's most popular podcast, right? Or they're complaining about it on the most popular cable news show, right? We should all be so silenced, right? So they haven't been silenced, and these things are clearly lies. And the other thing that I think is important to highlight from a sort of legal and regulatory policy is very few people have actually been technically silenced. And so if you define silence as losing your license or being reprimanded for spreading lies, very few, very, very few. The rhetoric that you see out in my universe is that thousands of voices have been silenced by some master elite few. This just isn't the case. In fact, very few doctors have been sanctioned in either Canada or the United States, and I understand why. You know, these are long legal proceedings that take time to go through. But even this woman, and this is the woman, by the way, Tenpenny, Dr. Tenpenny, who spread the magnet lie, only very recently had her license suspended. And it wasn't even for spreading COVID lies, it was for not cooperating with the regulators. Here's a piece in the Washington Post that again makes this point that doctors who spread misinformation are rarely punished. So here, this is a nice piece from the New England Journal of Medicine that makes the point I just made much more eloquently. There aren't always right answers, right? We all know that. The science evolves. There's a lot of scientific uncertainty. And often that uncertainty isn't communicated as well as it should have been. And we can come back to that. But there are some answers that are clearly wrong, right? And even if we just focus on those, we can make a real difference. Okay, obvious point number two. Obvious point number two. Yeah, it's social media. Social media has absolutely changed the way misinformation is being spread. You all know that. I said it was an obvious point, but it's still worth making. It's still worth making. Study after study, we've done research at our institute has looked at this. This was also a study from the University of Alberta. If you get your information from social media, and more of us do, especially the younger demographic, you're more likely to believe misinformation, more likely to spread misinformation. It's just, there's just so much research to back this up now, I think it's hard to dispute that. And the other obvious point is social media is filled with misinformation. I'm looking at the demo in this audience. How many people here are on TikTok? Be honest. Not very many. Okay, and I won't comment on the demo either. 2 billion human beings on planet Earth are on TikTok, right? It is a massively influential platform, and most. I have 4 kids, and I know this with my kids. They go to TikTok not for dancing videos. They go there for news. They go there for information, for science. That's where they get their information, is from TikTok. And study after study has shown that TikTok is filled with misinformation. This one found that 20% of what's pushed by their algorithm has misinformation in it. For some topics like vaccines, it's as much as 50%. So since that data came out, they've tried to improve, but I'm skeptical about how much they have improved. So yeah, social media, a major problem. And as I've already used the word algorithms, a lot of it has to do with how they decide what we're all going to see. You know, the algorithms that control, for example, our search engines, just incredibly influential. We've done research on this at our institute. You know, what lands on your first page of a Google search, right? That's your information universe. You know, where do you hide a dead body, you guys? On the second page of a Google search, because no one goes there, right? It's that first page. And often it's filled with misinformation. And with the social media platforms, they play to our cognitive biases, right? Those algorithms. They play to our desire for prestige and to be known and to be seen, right? They play to our tendency towards in-group signaling, right? And they are often play to the reality that emotional, right, and negative news will get more traction. And of course, this just facilitates the spread of misinformation, as this very recent study has shown. And yes, AI is going to make all of this so much more challenging. This is one of the things that gets me, makes me very worried and makes me a little less optimistic than I have been in the past. Have you guys seen the studies that have shown? You probably have, right? That even academics can't tell the difference between a piece written by, in their area of specialty, a research paper written by AI and one written by humans, right? So this is really scary for a whole bunch of reasons. And then layer on top of that things like deep fakes. This was a study that, again, very, very recent, came out in August, that found even among educators, right? So the individuals that you would, teaching your kids about AI, 27 to 50%, depending on how you slice the data, but for us, a large portion of educators cannot distinguish real videos from fakes, right? So that's where we are. So it is incredibly problematic. And the other thing social media and algorithms do is they create echo chambers. Again, something you all know and realize. Now, there's been a lot of studies that have looked at this issue the way this study did. There's been several in Canada that came to the exact same results. One of my colleagues did a study like this, but I like this one because it really highlights the power of echo chambers and how they're formed. Very straightforward. They ask, if you're anti-vax, where do you get your news from? And yes, correlation, causation, we have to be careful about that. But when you're talking about an echo chamber, it's the correlation that matters, right? The correlation is what you're looking for. And what they found here is if you're anti-vax, you get your news from pretty questionable sources, right? How many people here know Natural News? Do not go to that website. It's just brutal. And then if you're pro-vax, you go to very particular websites. Again, legacy news media, right? Correlation, causation probably doesn't surprise you. But this matters, right? Because it really speaks to the echo chamber that people live in. So how can we break down those echo chambers? Have you guys heard of this study? This is a hilarious study. And it was a real study. It was done at Yale. And it was a relatively big N, given the nature of the study. Basically, what they did is they paid people, who were Fox News fans to watch CNN, right? And I love it, right? Because everyone knows what's going on here. It's like such a cynical study. You're just paying me to watch, Anderson Cooper. It's not going to work. But you know what, you guys? It did. It did. It had an impact on people's perceptions in virtually every metric they measured. Now, how long that would be sustained is another question, but the important thing is just exposing people to different perspectives, right, can make a difference. And I think that's a really important lesson, and we'll come back to that. And then, yes, there is the power of celebrity culture, the role of celebrities. Now, do celebrities play a big role in spreading misinformation? For sure they do. And the question people often ask me is why? Why? Well, I think a lot is going on. So, do you guys remember this? Kylie Minogue's friends, cousins' testicles. Is that the chain that caused? Right, I can't remember. Those testicles are a big theme here. I didn't realize that was going to play out like it. Those testicles ruined a week of my life, though. She basically got on Twitter and said that her friend's cousin's testicles were inflamed as a result of the COVID vaccine, right? So that went everywhere. So why did that have such a big impact? Yes, she's got a big following, and the megaphone does matter, right? That matters. I think she's got 30 million followers on Twitter, so that matters, right? The other thing is that many people might relate to Nicki Minaj. She's very likable. She produces great music. So that matters, right? You relate to the individual. The other thing that's going on is it's a scary story, right? It plays to your negativity bias. And there's lots and lots of research that tells us if a story is negative, if a story is scary, it's more likely to be remembered, more likely to be acted on, plays that very strong cognitive bias we all have. And yes, those from celebrities are scary stories from celebrities have a particular impact on all of us. So but the other thing that's happening here, and maybe it's the most important thing with celebrities, they're telling a story, right? They're telling a story. It's an anecdote, it's a narrative, and we know that stories have an incredible impact. Study after study, we've studied this also at our institute, but an anecdote or story narrative has ability to kind of shut down our tendency to think scientifically, right? And this is what was found in this 2016 study, and as I said, other studies have found this exact thing. And that's what's happening with celebrities, right? They're telling us stories. It's a story. Yes, it's one tweet, but it's a tweet about these testicles. It's a scary story about testicles from from Nicki Minaj. That is going to have, that story from Nicki Minaj outweighs hundreds of millions of data points, right, on safety and efficacy. And so that's one of the things that's happening here. And just to give you a sense, so this is a study that came out early in the pandemic, and I often refer to it. And there have been other studies since this, the one that I think have more complex methodologies, perhaps a little bit more robust, but replicating the spirit of what was found here. But I like this study because it's so straightforward. It was done at Oxford, and what basically they did is they looked at hundreds of bits of misinformation and traced the origin story. So where did that misinformation come from, basically? Straightforward question. And they found that 20% of all that misinformation came from what they call a prominent individual. So a celebrity, a sports star, politician, right? So that's a pretty big hunk in itself, right? That's not insignificant. That tells us this is something that we should pay attention to. But then look at the next line. 69% of us, the normies, we spread the stuff that comes from the celebrity, right? So that shows why it's a top-down, bottom-up phenomenon, but also shows why we really need to pay attention to that noise. Okay, so who believes this stuff? Who believes the misinformation? This is fantastically complex question. You could lecture out, you could do a whole course on this. Incredibly nuanced. But the big caveat is that we all can fall for it. We all can believe misinformation. I've fallen for misinformation. You've fallen for misinformation. In our chaotic information environment, it can impact all of us. It happens across the ideological spectrum, happens across the socioeconomic spectrum, and studies tell us that. With that caveat, though, I think there are some important themes that are emerging. This is a study that was done. My friend who collaborated, Gordon Pennycook, who was at the University of Regina, but he's left. He's a traitor. He went to Cornell, I think, in September, with David Rand at MIT. They've done a lot of really interesting work here. But what they found, and this is just an example data, because there's so much out there on this, they found a couple interesting things. Number one, your cognitive style matters, right? Are you more likely to deploy critical thinking skills? Obvious, right? But if you are, you're less likely to fall for misinformation. Other studies have found strong correlation with education. A study that came out today, which I tweeted about today, found that those with just a little bit of knowledge, it's that little bit of knowledge goes too far kind of thing. If you have a little bit of knowledge, you're but don't comprehensively understand a topic, you're more likely to believe misinformation, also more likely to distrust science. But that cognitive style, it matters, right? The other interesting thing here is they found that those who value democracy, less likely to fall for misinformation. And look at the side corollary to that, individuals who sort of put the individual over the government, more likely to fall for misinformation. And they end with good news, this idea, which we'll come back to at the very end, this idea of sort of pausing and embracing accuracy can make a difference. Lots of interesting research on this, trying to tease out this. But the other thing I think we need to recognize is when people are vulnerable, right? When there are times in people's lives when they might be more susceptible to misinformation. And we should remember this so we have empathy and understand what brought people to a particular place, as this recent study found. This was another study, and I found this one fascinating. It looks like a sort of almost a joke headline, but it was a real study. And what they found was those who were not in a loving relationship, Yes, they try to control for all the obvious variables. Those who are not in a loving relationship more likely to fall for misinformation and conspiracy theories, right? And what they speculate's going on is that conspiracy theories and misinformation become kind of a community, right? A way of connecting with others, a way of finding meaning in the world. And we should remember that again, so we have empathy for those who are struggling with misinformation. Things like economic disparity might make communities more susceptible to misinformation, and lots of interesting research now happening in the area of mental health and personality traits that make people more susceptible to misinformation. The bottom line is, it's complex and many things can draw people to misinformation. This is another really wonderful piece. Fear not, I'm not going to go through it in any detail, written by some superstars in the field. A lot of these are my friends. I'm mad they didn't invite me to be part of it, but they kind of map out all of those sort of psychological traits that can make anyone fall for false beliefs. But one of the things I want to come back to in just a moment is this idea of partisanship, ideology, personal views, because I think this is rising as importance. Okay, the other very obvious thing I'm going to touch on, I'm going to do this one very, very quickly, is the issue of trust. Because trust obviously matters a whole bunch. And study after study has shown that. And there are communities throughout the world that have historical and justified reasons for distrusting institutions, which can make them more susceptible to misinformation. But what we're seeing, study after study after study has shown that trust matters. This is just one example. I picked it because it's a recent one. Finding that those who distrust institutions are more likely to believe misinformation around ivermectin. And we're hearing a lot of conversation, and this goes back to my point about, yes, this is misinformation. We're hearing a lot of speculation about how missteps in communication by the government, by the CDC, by Health Canada, Public Health Agency of Canada, on and on, sort of created space for misinformation and almost placing blame on those institutions for the rise of misinformation. And I sympathize, and I've actually written several pieces on this. I sympathize with this position, but I think it's being overplayed now, because we forget that so often, the goal of the misinformation mongers, those who are generating, especially the disinformation, who they know it's misinformation, they're spreading it to fulfill an agenda. The goal of those misinformation mongers is to create distrust. That's the goal, right? They want to create distrust and that makes room for more misinformation. So you have this horrible distrust cycle that I think is playing out right now. And the last obvious point I want to make is this one. Yeah, it is ideology. It's ideology. It's ideology. And it wasn't always like this in my space, in the health space. Yeah, ideology was always lurking, but now it's at the fore, right? This is about ideology. I cannot believe the degree to which that is the case, right? If I had to pick two things why I'm a little more pessimistic than I have been in the past, it's AI and the role of ideology. Okay, and I want to emphasize here, and I'm going to emphasize it probably 3 more times, misinformation spreads across the ideological spectrum. Okay, I recognize that, and I think it's important important theme. But yeah, misinformation now in the health space has become about ideology. This is a piece I wrote for NBC. I'm going to quote myself, speaking of psychological issues. People come for the ideological spin. So there might be something that you find for completely reasonable reasons, intuitively appealing. Maybe it's small government, or you're really concerned about freedom of expression. Those are legitimate concerns, our points of view. But then you stay with that community despite the science-free lunacy. And we see this playing out again and again and again. And we're starting to see it, as I said, studies have shown it's happening more and more with medical misinformation. There's so many interesting studies that have come out over the last 6 months on this, but I find this one really powerful. Because what they did is in this study, it was a study of both the general public and physicians and MDs, right? And they were exploring the polarization around the public discourse on vaccine treatments, COVID treatments, right? So think about hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, right? That kind of thing, right? And what they found was that very, very related to ideology, but the polarization people's beliefs about these treatments was more strongly correlated with what cable news show they watched, and of course by that's code for Fox or CNN, right? Than the scientific literature. Isn't that unbelievable? And that's for doctors too, right? So you think about that. You're a patient in the United States, and you go see a physician, and their view on COVID treatments is more aligned with the Fox News show or CNN show they watch than the scientific literature. It's really amazing, right? And of course, the sad thing is, very recent study again, the sad thing is, once it becomes about ideology, it becomes much more difficult to change people's minds. And this was a study, again, very recent, that found that, once it becomes about ideology, you kind of become more resistant to fact checking. And it hasn't always been like that, you guys. So this is a little bit disheartening. And again, they just highlight the degree to which this is really about political devotion. Okay, again, I want to emphasize this happens across the ideological spectrum, depending on the topic. Like, misinformation about GMOs for a long time came largely from the left. It's starting to shift a little bit, but we've definitely seen that. It depends on the topic. But yes, in this cultural moment, right? The misinformation about health and many other things is coming from the right. It comes from, obviously the political extremes, as this highlights, but it's largely coming from the right. It hasn't always been like that, okay? And again, this is important to remember to give context to what we're talking about and why, the politics might matter. So this is a fascinating study, and there have been a number of studies that highlight this, but I like this one because it really illustrates it nicely. In the mid-'70s, right? So Vietnam War is over, Nixon he's out, and Agent Orange from, Vietnam, and we're starting to worry about the environment. In the 1970s, it was the Democrats that were the anti-science party, right? And the Republicans, very strongly, were the pro-science party, right? So this takes us back to the slides I started with, right? From Woodstock to Tucker's testicles, right? And now we're at a time of Tucker's testicles, right? Where it is the Republicans or the right, the conservatives, that are the anti-science party, which is a fascinating shift, right? And it's important to remember that when we're critiquing this. And this is killing people. Study after study after study from the US has shown the degree to which this is the case. It's killing people. Remember that the head of the FDA's comment about the impact of misinformation. But this is my favorite example of the role of ideology. So do you guys know Marin County outside of San Francisco? It's just a gorgeous part of the world. One of my good friends, Jennifer Gunter, Jen Gunter, the Vagina Bible author, I don't know if you know her, she lives there. So when I visit her, I go to Marin County. It's incredibly democratic, okay? Incredibly wealthy, very, very wealthy part of the world, very educated part of the world. You can kind of get the picture, right? Before the pandemic, Marin County was amongst the least vaccinated places in the United States, right? It was that new agey kind of, we're not going to get vaccinated, we're embracing the natural, right? The pandemic happens, and being anti-vax becomes a Republican flag, and now Marin County is one of the most vaccinated places in the United States. So this is educated, well-informed individuals who are being, I want to be careful here, but let's just for brevity's sake say, greatly motivated by in-group signaling and ideology in making their decision about themselves and their family. So really a fascinating shift, right? And here's an even more dramatic one, and more controversial and provocative example. This was done by a friend of mine, Frank Graves. You might know Frank. He's a very well-known, often cited pollster. And by the way, these results have been replicated in spirit by other researchers. And basically what Frank and others have found is if you are vaccinated, you're more likely to support Ukraine. If you're unvaccinated, you're more likely to support or be sympathetic to Putin. Isn't that unbelievable? And just to give you a sense of the data here, this is just one snippet. He found that 88% of vaccinated believe Russia is committing war crimes, only 35% of unvaccinated. That is a huge, for those of you who do survey research, you'll know, that is a huge gap. That is amazing. And so much is going on in that data, right? Ideology, in-group signaling, the role of state actors, right? The role of state actors in shaping people's opinions. Really, really incredible. And this kind of trend, unfortunately, is happening on so many different topics now. It's happening with climate change. Yes, those in the room who do climate change work will say, hey, it's always been there, ideology. But we're seeing it accelerate, right? The role of ideology and how people talk about climate change. It happened a lot with and this is an area where we're starting to do more work with wildfires. That became an ideological talking point, how they started and why. The 15-minute city, do you guys know the 15-minute city thing? Do you guys know? So the idea of a 15-minute city is that we should, it's about making livable cities so you can walk places and not have to use cars, and your grocery stores and your education and your healthcare facilities are nearby, right? There are cities that have tried this, and they're trying to and even Edmonton's trying to nudge in this direction. And it was suggested that this was a World Economic Forum conspiracy to put us all in districts like in the Hunger Game, right? The tyranny of walkability, right? But that's another really good example. The wellness industry, and as someone who's worked on alternative medicine and wellness industry for a long time, this has been a fascinating shift, right? To see it become about the alt-right. I mean, I never would have guessed if you talked to me in 5 or 6, 7, 8 years ago that supplements and acupuncture and all, that would be an alt-right phenomenon. I wouldn't have believed you, right? It's incredible how it's been captured by that community. The unproven therapies, like stem cell therapies, is a topic that we do a lot of research on, again, has become very much about ideology. Even yoga. Even yoga now has become increasingly about ideology. And that brings us back to Tucker's testicles. Okay, how do we respond? What do we do? So much we have to do, but yes, teaching critical thinking skills, absolutely fundamental, a core thing that we need to do. This is a great piece from the New York Times where they talk about how Finland starts teaching critical thinking skills in kindergarten. I think that's exactly what you start in kindergarten, you teach it throughout elementary school, in high school, through university, and classes should be available for adults too. And one of the reasons I like this is it's content neutral, right? You're not preaching what the answer is, you're giving people the skills necessary, right, to make that determination themselves. So that's so important. The other thing we need to do is we have to come at this topic from every direction. This is another terrific piece. Again, a superstar researchers. There's Kate Starbird. She's absolutely terrific. Where they looked at how you need to come at it from. It's a multi-pronged approach, right? We need to pre-bunk. We need to debunk. We need to nudge. And yes, we need to regulate carefully and transparently. If you do those things, and they found this, you can make a difference. So that's real. That is good news, right? What does a nudge look like? What do I mean by that? Well, thinking back to Gordon Pennycook and David Rand's suggestion of just pausing, right? Of just taking a beat to think about accuracy, that can make a difference, right? And I love that suggestion because we live in such a chaotic information environment. I love that suggestion because it's something you can remind yourself to do, and I have to do that sometimes. You can remind your family, your friends, and it might be scalable, right? It might be scalable. The other thing, of course, is to step back from the noise, right? There's research that shows that is also really important. So take a break. I try to shut down at 9 p.m., no social media, no news. Those of you who follow me on social media are probably going, yeah, sure, you do. But I really do. I try to. I interviewed a researcher who, this is all she does. She works in this space. And she actually has a bed for her phone, like an actual bed, right? And she puts it in, it has a little blanket and a pillow and a little light, and she puts her bed, it's a little ritual she does. Because she can't, it's asleep now, I can't go bug it. So I love that, and we could all do a little bit of that. This is a very recent study, as you can see, just this month. that has highlighted why this is important, right? Feeling overwhelmed, feeling tired, feeling like you're bombarded. This isn't going to surprise anyone. It's maybe an obvious conclusion, but it's good to have the data. It makes you more susceptible to misinformation. So, step back even for a moment. The other thing we can do is try to build bridges. So this research, I think, is quite tentative. It's early days, but this is some of that research that's trying to get how we break down those echo chambers, right? So this was a study that talked about going around the misinformation, sort of the topic that people are most concerned about, and focusing on a shared goal, right? So they did this study in the context of GMOs. And so instead of talking about, the health, what the data says specifically about GMOs, talk about the goal of fighting world hunger, right? Or talk about the goal of trying to help the environment. And the results in this study show that can really make a difference. That can work. So find those shared, because we all have them, right? Shared goals, right? Find those shared goals and make that the destination. This was another interesting study. Again, kind of same conclusion, right? If you learn about other communities, if you interact with other, and this is, by the way, is a call for diversity and having numerous voices be part of this conversation. If you do that, there's very practical reasons in the context of misinformation, less likely to believe misinformation, especially about those other communities, right? So that's also valuable. This is a topic that I'm becoming quite passionate about, and this is the idea of reporting on, communicating the nature of scientific consensus in a particular domain. Studies have shown that if you communicate what the scientific consensus actually says, people are less likely to believe misinformation, right? Because there's so much false balance out there. People think these fringe, unscientific positions should be given the same weight as the scientific consensus. And by the way, scientific consensus is not about groupthink. Scientists are always questioning each other. It's about reflecting what the current body of evidence, which is always evolving, right, says at the time, and really does make a difference. This was a fascinating study that was done in Europe that found that 90% of the population thought that doctors were divided on the value of the COVID vaccines, which is completely untrue, right? In that study, it was over 90% thought they were safe and effective, and a very small percentage had any concerns. I think it was 1 or 2%. And when that was communicated to the public, they changed their perspective, right? This was a very recent study that was done at UBC, kind of the same spirit. They ask experts in the field, do you think COVID vaccines are safe and effective for adults? 99% agreed. I bet you most Canadians don't realize the consensus is that strong. Do you agree? I bet they don't. And that's because of our social media environment is a false balance machine. And the good news is, as I said, you communicate what the scientific consensus actually says, you can make a real difference on people's perspectives. This is a brand new institute at Durham University that's just getting started. That's all they're going to do. They're going to try to determine what the scientific consensus is, recognizing it evolves and it's a shifting target, right? Get a sense of what the scientific consensus is and communicate it to the public, to the media, to policymakers, so that resource is available. And yes, we need to debunk. We need to get out there. We need to counter the misinformation, no matter how absurd. It really does work. Study after study after study has shown that it worked. Yes, it's complex, but if you do it right, you can take a picture of this and share it with your friends and family. If you do it well, you can make a difference. What does a good debunk look like? Provide the science. It makes a difference. Use clear, shareable content. What's it going to look like on Twitter, on Instagram? Number 4, so important, I've already talked about it, communicate that scientific consensus. Whether you're talking about GMOs or vaccines or climate change, studies have told us that can make a difference. You do want to be nice, you want to be authentic, you want to be humble. That does make a difference. Creativity wins. We have to use the anecdotes, the humor, the art to make a difference, right? And again, studies show that really can make a difference. I'll end with number 9. Remember that it's the general public. You focus on that movable middle. That should be your primary target because that's where you're going to have the biggest impact. This is our initiative. It's called #ScienceUpFirst. We're on Threads, we're on X, I guess it's called now, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. Please, we would love everyone to become part of the Science Up First team, where we try to make creative, creative content that's positive, that uses diverse voices to counter the misinformation that is out there on a range of topics. All you have to do is follow us, become part of the community. We would love to have you. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very, very much for this opportunity. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you, friends.
Thanks so much to Professor Caulfield. We have a very short amount of time for questions. I know some students will have to run to class, but if you want to ask a question, if you could get, there's mics on the side, you can get up, introduce yourself, your name, and ask Professor Caulfield a question just before we wrap up here. I think we'll give ourselves 5 minutes here.
Hi, Professor Caulfield. Thanks so much for that. I'm wondering what suggestions you have for people to deal with that, that response that sometimes comes because of things like the change in approach to masking at the beginning of the pandemic, and the suggestion that shows that scientists don't know what they're talking about and they're just making it up, and they're, all of that.
Yeah, it's a great question. As you can imagine, I hear that almost daily. It's first, number one, I think that the science communication was less than ideal, for sure, early days. So as a community, I think we have to get better at communicating science and scientific uncertainty. And I understand why the public health agencies around the world started with that message, right? Because the science was fluid, and for those of you who work in public health, one of the things you're supposed to do is make your public health message clear and actionable, right? And I think that they overshot on a couple of things early days in the pandemic. I think the response is that science is not a list of facts, right? Science is not a list of facts. It's a process, and it's always going to be changing. And changing your mind on a topic is a badge of honor, not something you should be ashamed of, right? It's a badge of honor. It shows that you're following the evidence where it leads you. But I do think, and that strategy, the idea of saying that, look, I'm changing because that's where the evidence there's some evidence that helps with a sector, not those hardcore deniers know, but with a sector that can make a difference. And I think the other thing that is important is to remind the policymakers to communicate uncertainty better. I think you can still make a powerful message while respecting the scientific uncertainty, and I think they got better. They sound like a conspiracy theorist. They got better, right? As the pandemic went on, and we're starting to see a lot of public health agencies reflect on exactly how that kind of messaging should look. I could go on, but I see a couple other questions. Thank you. Yeah.
The scientific method. Censorship is not part of the scientific method, nor that applied to medical science. Early on, when the pandemic measures began, there was a degree of censorship which grew and grew. Now, there were people that could be found, as you say, using social media. Physicians, emergency room physicians were one of the early ones, other medical researchers of high standing, grandmasters in their field. And when they raised objections, they were slandered, canceled. Not, as I was taught, that you would have an open, free, and debate on the principles, on the data, not only on scientific method, but in this case, medical ethics. Medical ethics, I would say, number one, primum non nocere, first, do no harm. Two, the cure must be worse than the disease. Three, treat the sick. Four, informed consent. And all those who raised that were subject to being canceled, threatened. And if there's anything that raises question and credibility of government agencies, is when they and others, what we used to call a free press, which clearly doesn't exist anymore, not in the formal sense, began to censor.
As you can imagine, I'm well aware of the voices that you're talking about. And they didn't listen to the science. It's one thing to raise a contrary view, and science thrives on contrary, controversial views. Think about plate tectonics. Think about the idea that ulcers are caused by bacteria. Right? Those were controversial topics, but those were topics that were tested using science. And when science emerged to counter their perspectives or to embrace them, the scientific community moved with that narrative. And indeed, those two examples I used, they were brought up in a scientific forum. And then future analysis also happened in a scientific forum. It didn't happen on a podcast. It didn't happen on social media. And the other thing I have to say is often those voices, and there's research that backs this up too, are equally vicious. I've been subject to constant bombardment about lies, misinformation about where I get my funding, death threats, people raising my family and kids, those voices, right? And it's unfortunate that that's where we are right now, but we also have to remember that they haven't been silenced. They haven't been silenced. In fact, very few of them have been reprimanded by either their institution or by a regulatory body. And their perspectives, as our own research has shown, got an outsized representation in public discourse and had, unfortunately, an adverse impact on public discussions. Early days, as I said already, could we have handled the scientific discrepancies, the scientific uncertainties better? Yes, I think we could have, and I hope that we've learned constructively and will move forward. So we're ready for the next pandemic, which is going to come, or the next public health crisis, or the next international conflict, which we're in today, that we're better able to handle it. But there's just no doubt, and that's why I focused on things that were clearly wrong, that were clearly misinformation, because even tackling that kind of misinformation will make a difference. And many of the voices that you're referring to have pushed misinformation about ivermectin, about sudden deaths, about infertility, which is just simply scientifically both implausible and not shown to be true. So it is a polarized time right now, and I do worry how we treat each other. And with Science Up First, we made a decision. Sorry, I'm going on too long, but it's an important question. With Science Up First, we made a decision to always be constructive, right? To always be constructive and to be positive and respectful in our interactions. Now, on my own feed, sometimes I'm a little more snarky. Sometimes when it gets personal, it's hard not to be. But I hope that we can have the constructive conversations going forward. And we've learned by our mistakes, the mistakes that we've all made in the past.
Thanks so much, Professor Caulfield. Unfortunately, we're at time. I know there's a few more
I can
questions.
catch you.
Nisha wanted to thank you on behalf of the students.
Yeah. Thank you on behalf of the students, the faculty, the staff, and all of our visiting guests. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks, guys.